My name is Isabella Clark, and I'm 29 years old. That night at the dinner table is burned into my memory so vividly, I can still smell the rosemary chicken my mother had made and hear the faint clink of wine glasses from across the room. It was supposed to be a casual family gathering, just my parents, my older brother Matthew, my younger sister Rachel, and me. But like most family dinners, it didn't take long for the conversation to turn into a highlight reel of everyone's achievements. Rachel had just finished explaining to my father how her firm had secured a massive corporate client. She was leaning back in her chair, hair perfectly curled, wearing a blazer that probably cost more than my rent. My mother was beaming at her, Matthew nodded in approval, and my father looked at her like she'd just won an Olympic medal. Then Rachel's eyes slid over to me. "You'll never be as successful as me," she said casually, like she was commenting on the weather. Her tone wasn't angry or even mocking. It was worse than that. It was certain, as if she was simply stating a fact we had all silently agreed on for years. For a moment, no one spoke. And then Matthew chuckled under his breath. My father smirked. Even my mother gave a little laugh as if Rachel had told a mildly inappropriate joke. I didn't laugh. I didn't even look at her. I just stared down at my plate, pushing a piece of roasted potato around with my fork. "Maybe you're right," I said softly. Before I continue, let me know in the comments where you're watching from, and don't forget to like and subscribe if you've ever been underestimated by the people who should have supported you most. Because what happened after this dinner changed everything. Outwardly, my voice was calm, almost indifferent. Inwardly, it felt like a tectonic plate in my chest had just shifted. I'd heard similar comments from her before, dozens of them over the years, but this time, it didn't roll off my back. This time, it lodged itself deep inside me, right next to the years of subtle jabs, dismissive remarks, and comparisons I'd been subjected to since we were kids. I left the table early that night, claiming a headache. No one protested. My absence didn't shift the energy in the room. They just kept eating and talking, probably moving on to the next topic, Rachel's upcoming trip to Europe or Matthew's promotion at his engineering firm. I walked to my car with my coat draped over my arm, the cool night air stinging my cheeks, and the words she'd spoken replaying over and over in my head. "You'll never be as successful as me." She meant it. She'd meant it for years, really, even before we were adults. Rachel had always been competitive, and in our family's unspoken hierarchy, success was defined very narrowly. Prestigious job, high income, public recognition. Anything else was considered cute or just a hobby. My graphic design business had been sustaining me for 4 years. I had loyal clients, steady income, and the freedom to work from anywhere. But to my family, it was never real work. Every holiday, someone would inevitably ask when I planned to get serious about my career, as if the invoices I sent every month didn't count. That night, when I got home to my small apartment, I didn't cry. I didn't call a friend to vent. I just sat at my desk, staring at my laptop. My portfolio was open on the screen, filled with work I was proud of. Branding projects, ad campaigns, book covers I'd designed. And for the first time, instead of feeling small when I thought about Rachel's comment, I felt a slow, steady heat rising in my chest. They could underestimate me all they wanted. They could laugh at me over dinner. They could dismiss my work and pretend it didn't matter. I was going to prove them wrong, not by shouting at that dinner table, not by sending angry texts, and not by trying to meet their definition of success. No, my proof would come in the form of results so undeniable that the next time Rachel saw me, she wouldn't be able to laugh. I started thinking about the projects I'd been putting off, the risks I'd been too cautious to take. For months, I'd been considering expanding my services, creating a design course, and maybe even opening a small creative studio downtown. But I'd always told myself it was too soon, too risky, too ambitious. Rachel's words had just erased every excuse I'd been clinging to. It wasn't about competing with her. It was about finally stepping into the version of myself I'd been holding back. The version that didn't need her approval, or my parents', or anyone's. That night, I opened a fresh page in my notebook and wrote 3 words at the top: prove them wrong. Underneath, I started making a list. Every goal, every idea, every connection I needed to make. I stayed up past 2 a.m., not out of anger, but out of focus. Over the next few days, the comments stopped stinging and started fueling me. I replayed it when I woke up, when I went to bed, when I felt tempted to procrastinate. Every time my motivation wavered, I imagined Rachel's smirk across the table. And I knew. One day, I'd look back at that moment not as the night my sister humiliated me, but as the night she unknowingly lit the fuse on the biggest transformation of my life. In the days after that dinner, I found myself waking up earlier than usual. Not because I'd suddenly become a morning person, but because my mind wouldn't let me rest. I'd open my eyes and immediately see that list I'd written in my notebook, prove them wrong, and the bullet points beneath it. I wasn't looking for quick wins. I wasn't looking to throw my family's words back at them by next week. This was going to take time, months, maybe years, and that was fine with me. I'd spent years quietly enduring their condescension. I could spend a year or two quietly dismantling it. The first step was looking honestly at where I was. My business was steady, yes, but it wasn't growing. My clients were loyal, but I'd been relying on the same small network for too long. My work was good, but it wasn't remarkable enough to turn heads outside of my existing circles. I knew that if I wanted to change the way my family saw me, I needed to first change the way I saw myself as a business owner. I started by reaching out to a designer I admired, Leah Winters, whose work I had followed online for years. She ran a small but well-known design agency in Chicago, and her projects regularly got featured in industry magazines. I didn't know if she would even respond, but I sent her an email asking if she'd be willing to meet for coffee and offer some advice on scaling a design business. To my surprise, she said yes. The following week, I took the train into the city and met her at a corner cafe. Leah was warm, direct, and refreshingly honest. She didn't sugarcoat anything. "You've got the skills," she said, flipping through my portfolio. "But you're playing small. You're designing for clients who think good design is a luxury, not a necessity. If you want to grow, you need to work with clients who see it as an investment and are willing to pay accordingly." Her words stung, not because they were harsh, but because they were true. She gave me a list of 3 industry conferences I should attend that year, even if it meant flying across the country. She suggested I start writing articles about design trends and brand strategy, building my authority in the field. And she told me, point blank, to raise my rates. "You're undercharging," she said. "You're not just selling your time, you're selling your expertise. Price like you believe in it." I left that meeting feeling both overwhelmed and electrified. It was the first time in a long time that I'd felt like someone saw my potential without needing me to prove anything first. The next morning, I made my first uncomfortable move. I emailed 3 of my newer clients to inform them that my rates would be increasing for all projects starting the following month. I half expected them to walk away. To my surprise, all 3 agreed without hesitation. With that small win under my belt, I threw myself into learning. I signed up for an online course on advanced branding strategy. I started posting weekly on LinkedIn, short, thoughtful pieces about design mistakes businesses make and how to fix them. My posts didn't go viral, but slowly I started getting messages from people I'd never met who wanted to work with me. Meanwhile, my family had no idea what I was doing. That was intentional. If Rachel or my parents asked how work was going, I gave them vague, unremarkable answers. "Busy as always," or "things are fine." I wanted them to think nothing had changed, until the change was too big to ignore. One Friday evening, I was sitting at my desk, reviewing a brand pitch I'd prepared for a potential client, when my phone buzzed. It was my college friend, Marissa. She worked at a mid-sized marketing agency and had been quietly following my work online. "Hey," she said when I answered. "How would you feel about designing a full rebrand for one of our biggest clients? Their CEO's been unhappy with their current look, and I showed them some of your portfolio pieces. They loved them." I nearly dropped my pen. This wasn't just a bigger client. It was a well-known name in the tech industry. The kind of client whose logo on my website could change the entire trajectory of my business. The proposal process took 2 weeks, and I poured everything I had into it. Late nights, early mornings, endless revisions. When they called to say I'd won the contract, I had to put the phone down and take a deep breath before I could even thank them. It was the first domino. That project led to 2 referrals. Those referrals led to more. My calendar started filling up with work I actually wanted to do, not just projects that paid the bills. And with every new client, I felt myself standing taller, speaking more confidently, owning my title as a creative director rather than just a freelancer. But it wasn't just about money or prestige. It was about proving to myself that I could grow something real, something that reflected my vision without needing Rachel's approval or my parents' acknowledgement. By late spring, I had saved enough to rent a small studio space downtown. It wasn't glamorous. Exposed brick, second-hand furniture, and a coffee machine that only worked half the time, but it was mine. I hired a part-time assistant, a recent design school graduate named Oliver, whose enthusiasm made me remember why I had started this work in the first place. From that little studio, I began planning my next move, hosting my own design workshop. Leah's advice about building authority had been echoing in my head for months, and I knew that putting myself in front of a room full of aspiring designers would force me to own my expertise. It was terrifying. It was exhilarating. I booked the venue before I could talk myself out of it. As the workshop date approached, I thought more and more about Rachel's smirk at that dinner table. I thought about how she'd looked so sure, so confident that her definition of success was the only one that mattered. I didn't hate her for it anymore. If anything, I was starting to feel grateful. She'd handed me the push I didn't know I needed, but I wasn't ready to let her, or anyone else in my family, see what I was building. Not yet. When the time came, it wouldn't be an update. It would be a reveal. One night, after locking up the studio, I stood on the sidewalk and looked at the sign on the door. Clark Creative Studio. It was simple, understated, but it was mine. And for the first time in my life, I didn't just believe I could be as successful as Rachel. I believed I could be more. And when that day came, I wouldn't have to say a word. The morning of my first design workshop, I stood in front of the mirror adjusting the sleeves of my blazer, my stomach a tangle of excitement and nerves. I'd hosted Zoom presentations before, even spoken at a few small networking events, but this was different. This was my event. My name on the flyers, my studio's logo at the bottom. I had expected 10, maybe 12 attendees. But as I arrived at the rented co-working space downtown, I was stunned to see more than 30 people milling about, sipping coffee and flipping through the printed workbooks I'd made. Some had heard about me through my LinkedIn posts. Others were referrals from Leah, and a few were simply curious locals who wanted to learn more about branding. As I set up my slides, a young woman approached me, smiling nervously. "Hi, I'm Carmen," she said. "I've been following your work for a year. You're the reason I decided to start my own freelance design business." I managed to thank her without my voice cracking, but inside, I was floored. This was the first time I'd heard anyone say my work had inspired them to take action. The workshop went better than I could have imagined. People asked thoughtful questions, laughed at my little jokes, scribbled down notes like what I was saying mattered. When it ended, several attendees lingered to thank me or ask about my services. I left with 3 new client inquiries before I'd even packed up my laptop. But that wasn't the real turning point. The real turning point came 3 days later when a local business magazine emailed me. One of their writers who'd attended the workshop wanted to feature me in their Women in Business column. The idea of my name and photo in print, alongside words like entrepreneur and creative director, made my pulse race. I agreed instantly. The interview was quick, maybe 30 minutes, but the writer was sharp. She asked about my early struggles, the decision to open my studio, and my advice for women starting out in male-dominated industries. I didn't mention my family. I didn't need to. This was my story, on my terms. When the article came out 2 weeks later, it spread farther than I expected. Clients sent congratulations. Former classmates commented on my social posts. Even Leah sent a message saying, "Proud of you, keep going." And then a text came in from my mother. "Saw your article. That's impressive. We didn't know things were going so well." The "we" told me everything. They were talking about me, not in the "is she ever going to grow up" tone they used to, but in a way that hinted at curiosity, maybe even respect. I didn't reply right away. I wanted to sit with the moment. It wasn't validation, not exactly, but it was proof that my work had reached them without me handing it to them. They'd found it on their own, and that was better than anything I could have forced. A week later, I got a call from my brother Matthew. "I read that article about you," he said. "Didn't know you had a whole studio now. That's big, Izzy." It was the first time in years he'd used my nickname. I kept my response polite and brief, then hung up, staring at my phone. I'd told myself this was about my own growth, not about changing how my family saw me. But if I was honest, a part of me had always wanted this, to have them finally see I wasn't some drifting artist. Still, I didn't let that part take over. I had more work to do. The momentum from the article brought new opportunities. Carmen, the young woman from my workshop, emailed to say she'd landed her first paying client and credited my advice. Another attendee invited me to speak at a small business conference. My calendar was suddenly full, not just with client work, but with events and collaborations that pushed me out of my comfort zone. Meanwhile, Rachel stayed silent. If she'd seen the article, and I had no doubt she had, she wasn't saying anything. Maybe she thought ignoring it would make it less real. Or maybe she just didn't care. Either way, I wasn't going to break the silence. In late summer, the business magazine emailed me again, this time asking if I'd like to be part of their annual Top 40 Under 40 feature. I reread the message twice, my hands trembling. This wasn't just a small column. This was a list people remembered. I said yes. The photo shoot was surreal, me in front of a white backdrop, lights flashing, a stylist fussing with my hair. They interviewed me again, this time with more depth about my career, my studio, and the clients I'd worked with over the past year. When the issue came out, I didn't even have to wonder if my family would see it. The magazine's social media post tagged me, and my phone blew up with notifications. Friends, former coworkers, even old acquaintances from high school commented. And then, one evening, I got a single-line text from Rachel. "Nice to see you finally doing something serious." I stared at it for a long time. Part of me wanted to reply with something sharp. Part of me wanted to send a simple thanks. But in the end, I didn't respond at all. Because this wasn't about her. Not anymore. That night, I stood in my studio long after Oliver had gone home, looking at the projects pinned to the corkboard. I'd built all of this in less than a year. Not just the physical space, but the reputation, the momentum, the sense of purpose. And I wasn't done. If the first phase had been proving to myself that I could grow, the next phase was about scaling in a way that would make my work and my name unavoidable. One day, Rachel would have no choice but to acknowledge what I'd built. And when she did, It wouldn't be because I demanded it. It would be because my success left her no other option. By early autumn, my studio felt like a different world from the one I'd lived in a year ago. The walls, once bare brick, were now lined with framed pieces of my work, branding campaigns, product packaging, even a few fine art prints I'd sold at local galleries. Oliver kept the space humming like a real agency, managing schedules, sending invoices, and greeting clients like we were a company 3 times our size. And then came the email that changed the game. A mid-sized investment firm had reached out for a complete rebrand. They wanted everything: logo, website, marketing materials, and their budget was bigger than any project I'd taken on. The kicker? They were hosting a networking gala to announce their new image, and they wanted me there as a featured guest. It wasn't until I saw the firm's board members listed in the proposal documents that I understood why this felt so familiar. One of them was a partner at the law firm where Rachel worked. I sat back in my chair, heart thudding. It didn't mean Rachel would be there, but it meant she could be. And if she was, I wouldn't be able to hide behind a computer screen or a vague LinkedIn post. For a moment, I debated turning the project down. But the truth was, this was exactly the kind of client I'd been working toward all year. To reject it just because it might bring me face to face with my sister? That would be letting her win before the game even started. So I said yes. The project was intense but exhilarating. The firm's CEO was decisive but open to bold ideas, and within weeks we had transformed their tired corporate look into something sleek, modern, and memorable. The team loved it so much they commissioned branded merchandise, and Oliver and I spent hours coordinating the production schedule so everything would be ready for the gala. 2 months later, the night arrived. The event was held at a downtown hotel ballroom, lit with soft amber lights that made the whole space glow. Waiters floated through the crowd with trays of champagne flutes, and a string quartet played near the entrance. My work was everywhere, projected onto massive screens, printed on banners, displayed on glossy portfolios at each table. As I mingled with guests, accepting congratulations, I felt solid. Not nervous, not out of place. Solid. And then I saw her. Rachel. She was standing near the back, talking to a group of sharply dressed men and women, her hair in a sleek bun, her posture perfect. She hadn't seen me yet, and I found myself studying her the way I might a stranger, taking in the confident tilt of her chin, the way she held her wine glass. She looked exactly the same as she had at that dinner table months ago, but I didn't feel the same looking at her. I was no longer the sister trying to measure up. I was the creative director whose work was literally hanging from the ceiling above her head. The CEO eventually introduced me to the crowd, thanking me for the rebrand. The applause that followed was polite but warm, and I could feel Rachel's gaze on me even before I spotted her in the audience. Our eyes met for half a second, hers unreadable, mine steady. And then I was swept into another conversation. Later, as I was picking up my coat from the check room, I heard her voice behind me. "So this is what you've been up to." I turned, and there she was, her expression somewhere between curiosity and disbelief. "Looks like it," I said evenly. She glanced around the room, at the banners, the screens, the branded gift bags. "It's bigger than I expected." I smiled faintly. "Most things are when you actually pay attention." Her jaw tightened, but she didn't take the bait. "Well," she said after a pause, "congratulations." The word sounded like it had to fight its way out. "Thanks." I slid my coat on and gave her a nod before walking away, leaving her standing in the crowd. In the taxi home, I replayed the moment. Not because it was dramatic, it wasn't, but because it marked something important. Rachel had seen me, really seen me, in a context where my work spoke for itself, and she hadn't been able to dismiss it with a laugh. Over the next week, little ripples from the gala reached me, My mother sent a text. Rachel mentioned your work was featured at some big event. She sounded impressed. Matthew called to ask if I'd ever consider doing a project for his engineering firm. Even my father, who rarely involved himself in anything unrelated to his business, forwarded me an email from one of his contacts who'd been at the gala and wanted to hire me. It was working. Not in a gloating way, but in the quiet, undeniable way I'd hoped for. But success, I realized, wasn't just about what my family thought of me now. It was about the doors opening that I never would have been invited through before. 2 weeks after the gala, I got a call from a regional conference organizer asking if I'd keynote a panel on design innovation. The panel would be sponsored by several major companies, including, I noticed, Rachel's law firm. I didn't even hesitate. Yes, I said. If the gala had been a subtle crossing of paths, this would be a head-on collision. The conference day began before sunrise. My alarm cut through the dark, and for a moment I lay still, staring at the ceiling, feeling the weight of what was ahead. The past year had been full of shifts and quiet victories, but this would be different. This wouldn't be a magazine article or a project unveiled in a client's office. This would be me, in front of hundreds of people, taking my place as an expert. And among them, somewhere in that audience, would be my sister. The hotel ballroom was unrecognizable from the bare space I'd seen in photos. Heavy velvet curtains framed the stage, spotlights angled toward the podium, and screens on either side displayed my name beneath the words, "Keynote Speaker." The air was charged with the low hum of conversations, the rustle of programs, the clink of coffee cups on saucers. I could feel the collective anticipation before the first session even began. I moved through the backstage area, adjusting the thin wireless microphone clipped to my lapel. The conference staff were efficient, guiding me through the schedule and showing me where I'd step out onto the stage. I nodded, half listening, my focus turned inward. I thought about the path here, the small beginnings, the late nights at my desk, the moments I doubted my decision to keep my head down instead of trying to prove myself directly to my family. When my name was announced, the applause rolled forward like a wave. I stepped into the light and felt the room shift. Eyes turned toward me, not in judgment, not in casual dismissal, but in expectation. I could almost pinpoint the moment my gaze crossed Rachel's, though I didn't linger. I'd learned not to perform for her. This was for me, and for the people who had come to hear what I had to offer. I began speaking, my voice steady, carrying over the quiet. I talked about design as more than aesthetics, about how it shapes perception, influences trust, and tells a story without words. I told them about the projects that had challenged me, the clients who had trusted me to take risks, the brands that had emerged from my work transformed. I layered in the lessons I'd learned the hard way, how undervaluing yourself becomes a habit if you let it, how growth often begins where comfort ends. The screen behind me shifted through slides of my work, before and after transformations of brands that had gone from forgettable to unforgettable. I watched as people leaned forward, taking notes, their eyes following the images with interest. Somewhere in the rows of faces, Rachel was watching the same screens. The thought flickered briefly, then fell away as I continued. I spoke about the years I'd spent working quietly, the importance of building credibility in spaces where no one is looking, and the power of momentum. Every sentence I delivered felt like another brick laid in the foundation I'd been constructing for the last 12 months, solid, unshakable, mine. When I finished, the applause was louder, longer. I stepped down from the stage and moved to the side as the moderator introduced the next speaker. People approached me in the break that followed. Design students, small business owners, marketing executives, all with questions or congratulations. Business cards changed hands, LinkedIn requests buzzed on my phone. The energy was electric, and for once I allowed myself to stand in it fully without diminishing what I'd accomplished. I caught glimpses of Rachel during the afternoon sessions. She was always in conversation, her body angled toward others, but occasionally her gaze drifted toward me. Not sharp or challenging like before, something quieter, almost calculating. Whatever she was thinking, she kept it to herself. By the end of the day, I had 3 new potential clients, an invitation to collaborate on a regional campaign, and a request from the conference organizers to consider returning next year. But beyond the tangible results, there was a deeper shift. I had crossed an invisible threshold. I wasn't just participating in my industry anymore, I was helping shape it, and the people who mattered here recognized it. I left the conference hall with the late afternoon sun spilling across the city. The sidewalks were crowded with commuters, the air sharp with the first hints of autumn. I walked without rushing, letting the day settle over me. My feet ached, my voice was tired, but my mind was sharp. There had been a time when I imagined my victory moment with Rachel as something cinematic, her stunned silence, my perfectly timed response. But that wasn't reality. This wasn't about delivering one perfect blow. It was about consistently showing up in ways that made her opinion irrelevant. And slowly, piece by piece, that was exactly what I was doing. In the weeks after the conference, my work seemed to accelerate on its own. The keynote had been filmed, and clips circulated online, tagged by attendees who had found something useful in my words. The article from the year before resurfaced as people linked my past and present work, creating a narrative I hadn't planned but was happy to embrace. I saw my own name in headlines that described me as a leading creative voice, and I didn't flinch. Rachel didn't reach out. My mother mentioned in passing during one of her brief texts that Rachel had seen the video. That was all she said, but I could imagine her watching it, hearing the applause, seeing my work projected on those massive screens. I didn't need her to tell me what she thought. I already knew it had landed. The studio was busier than ever, and I found myself making decisions I'd never imagined a year ago. Turning down clients whose projects didn't align with my vision, investing in better equipment, planning another workshop series. Oliver thrived with the increased responsibility, and I began to think seriously about hiring another designer. Through it all, I kept my focus on the work, not the reaction. But there were moments, quiet, private ones, when I thought back to that dinner table, to Rachel's casual certainty that I'd never match her success. And in those moments, I didn't feel anger or the sharp sting of her words anymore. I felt distance. I felt perspective. Because I had come to understand something that had taken me years to see. The most powerful proof isn't in confrontation. It's in creating a life so full, so rooted in your own definition of success that no one else's measure matters. Standing on that stage had been one of those rare moments when the years of unseen work and the quiet determination all converge into something visible, undeniable. Not just to the people watching, but to me. Especially to me. And as the year drew toward its close, I knew this was only the midpoint of my story. The chapter where my name began to travel in circles it had never reached before. The chapter where my work became the conversation instead of my absence. The chapter where my sister was no longer the measure, just a footnote in the story of how I learned to measure myself. The weeks after the conference blurred together in a steady rhythm of work, travel, and unexpected messages from people I hadn't spoken to in years. The keynote video had made its way across LinkedIn, reposted by attendees and tagged in industry newsletters. Each time I opened my inbox, there seemed to be a new opportunity. A collaboration request, a speaking invitation, an inquiry from a client I'd once thought unreachable. But the real shift wasn't in my professional network. It was in the quiet ripple that began to move through my family. It started with Matthew. His calls had always been brief, more out of obligation than interest, but now they came with a different tone. He wanted to know about my projects, not just as polite conversation, but as if he was actually listening. He'd ask how I landed certain clients, how I balanced multiple deadlines, and, most telling, how I decided which offers to turn down. There was no condescension in his voice, no thinly veiled good for you before changing the subject. He sounded like a peer. Then came my parents. My mother's texts, once sparse and perfunctory, began arriving with links to articles about design trends or branding campaigns she thought I'd find interesting. She was still careful with her words, but there was something unfamiliar in them, a cautious respect, maybe even pride she didn't know how to express without softening it first. My father was slower to change, but even he had started mentioning me in conversations with his colleagues. I knew because a man I'd never met sent me an email saying he'd heard about my studio through your dad and wanted to discuss a project. Through all of this, Rachel stayed silent. Silence from her wasn't new, but it felt different now. It didn't carry the same smug indifference as before. It had weight to it, like she was deciding how, or if, she wanted to step into this new dynamic. For years, she'd been the one setting the standard, intentionally or not. Now, whether she liked it or not, the balance was shifting. The change wasn't just happening inside the family. I began to notice it in the way people in their circles spoke to me. At a charity auction my parents hosted in late autumn, I attended not as Isabella, Rachel's sister, but as Isabella, the creative director behind that rebrand everyone had been talking about. People asked about my studio before they asked about my family. My work was no longer an afterthought. It was at that event that I saw the first cracks in Rachel's composure. She was there, of course, perfect as always in a tailored black dress, moving easily through the crowd. But when a board member from her firm pulled me aside to compliment my conference talk, I caught the flicker in her expression. Not anger, not disbelief, something closer to recognition. I didn't engage with it. I didn't need to. Instead, I let the evening carry me. I left with new contacts, a handful of business cards, and the quiet satisfaction of knowing I hadn't sought this overlap. It had happened naturally, and it was undeniable. Back at the studio, the work kept building. Oliver and I were deep into planning a winter campaign for a boutique hotel chain, a project that would take us out of the city for a week of on-site design and photography. It was the kind of immersive, high-visibility work I'd once thought belonged to bigger agencies. Now, it was ours. On the flight to the first location, I thought about how far I'd come from the night of that dinner table comment. Back then, my instinct had been to retreat, to prove myself from a distance. And in many ways, I still was. But the difference now was that the proof was spilling into spaces I hadn't planned for. My name, my work, my reputation. They were moving faster than I could control, and for the first time that felt like a good thing. By December, the holiday season was pulling everyone into its orbit. My mother called to invite me to the annual Christmas Eve dinner, a gathering I'd skipped for the last 2 years. She didn't push when I hesitated. She simply said she hoped I would think about it, that it would mean a lot to have me there. I wasn't sure if I wanted to go. Part of me still remembered the sting of those dinners, the subtle comparisons, the way my accomplishments were glossed over in favor of someone else's. But another part of me was curious. What would it be like to walk back into that space now? Would they see me differently? Would I see myself differently? I didn't answer her right away. Instead, I let the invitation sit while I finished the hotel project, while I reviewed budgets for the first quarter, while I mapped out a series of workshops for the spring. Work gave me the space to decide without the weight of guilt or expectation pressing down. The truth was, I knew I would go. Not to prove anything to them, those days were over, but to see how it felt to exist in that room without shrinking. I'd built something solid enough that I could stand in their presence without measuring myself against their reactions. In the days leading up to Christmas Eve, I thought less about Rachel's silence and more about my own. I had never told her how much that dinner comment had stayed with me. I didn't plan to. Some things didn't need to be spoken to be understood. What mattered now was the life I'd built in the space between her words and my own decisions. A life that had become so rooted in my own definition of success that whether she acknowledged it or not had stopped being the point. Still, I couldn't deny that part of me wondered what she would do. If she would avoid me, if she would try to reclaim the upper hand, or if maybe she would say nothing at all and let the shift stand in the air between us, silent but undeniable. The night of the dinner, I would find out. And whatever happened, I knew this. The ripple had already reached her. The night of Christmas Eve arrived with a kind of stillness I hadn't expected. The city streets were quiet under a thin layer of snow, the air sharp enough to sting my lungs as I walked from the parking lot to my parents' front door. My boots crunched over the salted walkway, the sound crisp in the winter silence. The house looked exactly as it always had this time of year. Warm light spilling from the windows, a wreath on the door, the faint glow of the Christmas tree visible through the front bay window. I stood there for a moment before knocking, letting the memory of past holidays flicker through my mind. Years of walking into this same house feeling smaller than I was, bracing for the subtle comments, the way the conversation always seemed to curve away from me. Tonight, I wasn't bracing. I was arriving on my own terms. The door opened to my mother, her makeup perfectly done, her red dress as tailored as if she were hosting a charity gala instead of a family dinner. Her smile was practiced but softer than I remembered. She stepped aside, letting me in without hesitation. The warmth of the house wrapped around me, carrying the scent of roasted turkey, cinnamon, and the faint trace of pine from the tree. The living room looked like a holiday postcard, garland draped along the mantel, candles flickering, the tree heavy with ornaments collected over decades. Voices floated in from the dining room, low and mingled with the sound of glasses being set on the table. Rachel was already there. She stood near the table, pouring wine into the crystal glasses our mother reserved for special occasions. Her hair was pinned in an elegant twist, her dress a deep navy that caught the light. She glanced up when I entered. No smile, no frown, just a moment of stillness, like she was taking in the fact that I was actually there. I hung my coat over the back of a chair and moved into the room. Matthew was by the fireplace, talking to our father. They both looked over, their expressions measured but polite. There was no rush of greetings, no exclamations. It was as if my return was an event they didn't quite know how to handle. Dinner began with the usual motions. Plates passed, polite questions about work, short updates on travel and health. The conversation was careful, as though everyone was trying to avoid the invisible tripwires that had defined so many of our past gatherings. No one brought up the conference, or the article, or the gala, but I could feel those things in the air, as present as the centerpiece on the table. I noticed the changes in myself more than I noticed any change in them. My posture didn't fold inward. My voice didn't soften when I spoke. I didn't rush to fill silences or to steer the conversation toward something safe. I simply existed at the table as I was, without apology. Rachel mostly listened. When she spoke, it was brief. Updates about a case she was working on, a mention of an upcoming trip. I didn't sense the edge that used to be there, the quiet competition woven into every word. But I didn't mistake her calm for warmth either. It felt more like she was watching, taking notes in her own mind. At one point, my mother asked if I would pass the cranberry sauce. It was such a small thing, but it landed differently. There was no clipped tone, no offhand remark about me being so quiet or hard to read. Just a request, plain and uncolored. As the meal went on, I let my gaze move around the table. I saw the careful way my father leaned in when Matthew spoke, The way my mother adjusted the napkins without looking down. The way Rachel's wine glass caught the light with each slow turn of her wrist. These were all familiar movements, part of the choreography of our family dinners. But tonight, I didn't feel like a background character watching from the edge of the stage. Dessert was served, my mother's pecan pie, which I hadn't tasted in years. The first bite was warm and sweet, and for a moment it felt like being a child again, before I'd learned how easily the warmth could be replaced with cold. But even in that moment, I knew I wasn't slipping back into old patterns. This wasn't nostalgia, it was recognition. I could take what I wanted from the past without letting it define my place here now. When the plates were cleared, we moved into the living room. The fire was low, casting a soft orange glow across the room. Gift bags sat under the tree, and my mother handed them out one by one. Inside mine was a scarf, deep green and cashmere soft, along with a handwritten note. The words were simple, wishing me warmth and joy in the year ahead, but I could tell she had taken time with them. It wasn't an apology, but it was something. Rachel's gift to me was a book on modern architecture. I didn't know if it was chosen for a reason or if it had been a safe, neutral pick. Either way, I thanked her with the same even tone I'd used all evening. As the night wound down, I stayed seated while others began collecting coats and leftovers. I let myself watch the room, the small pockets of conversation, the clink of wine glasses being stacked by the sink, the faint sound of carols playing from the kitchen radio. I thought about the years I'd left this house feeling smaller than when I'd arrived, carrying the weight of every comment and every omission. Tonight, I felt no smaller than when I'd walked in. If anything, I felt a little taller. When it was time to leave, there were polite goodbyes, soft smiles, the usual exchange of drive safe and Merry Christmas. Rachel and I exchanged a nod, nothing more, nothing less, and that was fine. Outside, the snow had stopped, leaving the night still and bright under the streetlights. I walked back to my car, the cold air sharp against my face, and slid into the driver's seat without looking back at the house. It struck me then that my return hadn't been about them. It had been about me, about proving that I could stand in that room without needing anything from it. I didn't come back for validation, or to prove my worth, or to rewrite the past. I came back to see if I could be in their world without losing myself in it. And I had. The weeks after Christmas settled into a steady rhythm. The studio was busy, the winter light spilling across my desk each morning as Oliver and I moved through deadlines. The quiet of January always brought a kind of clarity. Projects felt focused, conversations sharper, decisions cleaner. I welcomed it. But even in that clarity, I began to notice something shifting. It started with a phone call from a new prospective client, a tech startup looking for a full visual identity before their product launch. As we talked through their needs, they mentioned their legal team would be reviewing any design contracts before signing. When I asked for the firm's name, it was one I recognized instantly: Rachel's. There was no guarantee she would be involved directly, but the overlap was there. I accepted the project without hesitation. The work was exactly in my wheelhouse, and I had stopped making career decisions based on the possibility of seeing my sister's name on an email signature. 2 weeks later, I got my answer. The first round of legal feedback came through, and there it was, her name at the bottom of the document. No greeting, no acknowledgement, just the crisp formality of legal review notes. I read through them twice. They were thorough, professional, and in some ways, almost overly careful. I wondered if she knew I would be reading them. The project moved forward without direct contact between us, but the connection lingered. Every file I sent, every brand element I designed, I knew she was seeing it. It was a strange feeling, like being in the same room without speaking, the air filled with unspoken history neither of us seemed ready to address. It didn't stop there. In February, I was invited to participate in a panel discussion on creative partnerships at a regional business forum. The organizer sent me the list of panelists, and my eyes caught on a familiar name in the corporate counsel slot. Rachel again. Different context, same collision. This time, we would be on the same stage. I arrived early the day of the event, setting my notes on the table, sipping coffee as the room filled. When she walked in, I felt the subtle shift in the air. She was in her element, composed, confident, scanning the room with that same assessing gaze I'd seen at countless family events. We didn't speak before the panel began. When the moderator introduced us, her description of my work was as polished as if she'd pulled it straight from my own bio. I listened without looking at Rachel, focusing instead on the audience. The discussion flowed easily. I talked about collaboration from the designer's perspective, how trust and respect shape the best projects. Rachel spoke about the importance of clear agreements and communication in business relationships. We didn't address each other directly, but there was an odd symmetry in our points, as if we were building parallel arguments toward the same unspoken conclusion. When it ended, the applause was polite but warm. People approached both of us with questions. I noticed more than once that someone would speak to me first, then glance at Rachel with recognition, as if connecting the fact that we shared a last name. We didn't linger afterward. I gathered my things, thanked the organizer, and left. In the elevator, alone, I thought about how inevitable this was becoming. The circles we moved in were overlapping more and more, and avoidance was no longer a realistic option. By March, it had happened again, this time at a charity art auction where one of my framed prints was up for bid. I hadn't known Rachel was on the event committee until I arrived and saw her name in the program. She was across the room when my piece was displayed, deep in conversation with a group of donors. I didn't approach her. I didn't need to. That night, my photograph sold for more than I dared to hope. The winning bidder was one of Rachel's firm's biggest clients. I couldn't ignore the symmetry. Neither could she. I caught her glance as the final number was announced. Not a challenge, not dismissal. Something else. Something quieter. By the end of winter, the pattern was clear. My work was no longer confined to spaces separate from hers. It was moving into her world, projects she had to review, events she attended, rooms where my name was spoken without me being there. I wasn't forcing it. It was happening on its own, and that was the most satisfying part. I didn't know how long she could keep ignoring it. But I knew this much. The longer it went unspoken, the heavier it would hang between us. And sooner or later, something would have to give. It was early April when the silence finally broke. The invitation came through in the form of a simple email from Rachel. No pleasantries, no explanations, just a line asking if I had time to meet for coffee the following week. The location she suggested was a cafe downtown, neutral territory, far from our family's orbit. I stared at the screen for a long time. In the months since Christmas, we had managed to exist in the same spaces without direct engagement. The collisions at events, the quiet overlaps in our work, the way our names kept surfacing in the same circles. All of it had been wrapped in a careful, mutual avoidance. Now, she was asking to break that pattern. I agreed, not out of curiosity, but because I knew it was inevitable. The question wasn't whether we would talk, it was when. The morning of the meeting, the sky was heavy with the kind of spring clouds that look ready to split open at any moment. I arrived a few minutes early, choosing a table near the window where the light was soft but steady. My coffee sat untouched as I watched people pass by outside, each one moving with their own unspoken purpose. When Rachel walked in, she looked exactly as she always did, composed, deliberate, carrying herself like someone who knew she belonged wherever she stood. She spotted me immediately and made her way over. She didn't waste time. After the briefest of greetings, she settled into her chair, her hands folded on the table in front of her. There was no small talk, no attempt to ease into the conversation. I listened. She spoke about the past few months in a way that was both measured and revealing. How my name kept appearing in her professional world, how my projects were being mentioned in meetings, how people she respected had begun associating me with high-level work. She admitted that it had forced her to reevaluate the way she'd thought about me. Not just recently, but for years. Her words weren't framed as an apology, but there was an undercurrent in them that felt like one. Not in the form of "I'm sorry," but in the acknowledgement of a gap she could no longer pretend didn't exist. I let her speak without interruption. I wasn't there to win an argument or deliver a speech I'd been holding on to. I had nothing to prove in that moment. My work had already done the proving. She spoke about her own career, the pressure, the constant need to be ahead, the way comparison had been as much a part of her life as it had been mine. I realized then that while I had been fighting to be seen, she had been fighting to maintain a position she believed she couldn't afford to lose. We had been caught in the same cycle, just on opposite sides of it. When she finally paused, there was a quiet between us that felt different from the silences we'd shared before. This one wasn't avoidance. It was space. Space for me to decide if I wanted to step into it. I told her, in measured words, that I had stopped needing her to see me, that the life I'd built now wasn't in reaction to her or to our family's expectations. It was mine, entirely. That didn't erase the years of feeling dismissed, but it made them matter less. Her gaze didn't drop, but something in her expression shifted. Not defeat, not guilt, something closer to acceptance. We didn't resolve everything in that one conversation. There was no sudden warmth, no cinematic reconciliation, but we reached an understanding, a recognition that we could move forward without pretending the past hadn't happened, and without letting it dictate every interaction that came next. When we stood to leave, she offered a handshake that turned into something closer to a brief, tentative embrace. It wasn't a promise, but it was a start. Walking back to my car, the air felt lighter, the clouds above thinning just enough for a patch of sunlight to break through. I realized I wasn't carrying her opinion with me anymore, not the old version of it, and not whatever new version she was forming. That was the real shift. The proof had never been about changing her mind. It had been about changing my own. By the time I reached the studio that afternoon, Oliver had already set out the day's project files. We dove back into work without me mentioning where I'd been. There was no need. This was my world now, steady, forward-moving, defined by the things I chose to build. And while Rachel and I had taken the first step toward something new, I knew I would measure our progress not by her words, but by how little I needed them. 6 months later, the world felt different, not because it had changed, but because I had. My days no longer revolved around proving anyone wrong. The studio had grown into something steady, a living, breathing extension of myself. Clients came from cities I'd never been to. Emails arrived from people who had seen my work online and wanted to hire me before even meeting me. My name began to travel in spaces where, years ago, I wouldn't have dared to think it belonged. It was no longer Rachel's sister walking into a room. It was just Isabella, and that was enough. The moment that would seal it in my memory happened on a crisp October afternoon. I had been invited to speak at a local creative conference, just a small panel about building a business from the ground up. But to me, it meant something bigger, an acknowledgement that my voice had value. The venue was a renovated warehouse, its brick walls lined with framed photographs from past events. High windows poured in warm autumn light. I arrived early and stood on stage before anyone filled the seats, looking out at rows of empty chairs. For years, I had imagined this view, wondering if I'd ever get here. When the panel began, I spoke with ease, my words flowing like they'd been waiting years to be heard. I talked about the late nights, the uncertainty, the way self-doubt could become both a shadow and a motivator. And I admitted that, for a long time, my work was fueled by the need to prove myself to the people who had underestimated me. That's when I saw her. Rachel. She was in the back row, sitting quietly, watching me. Her face gave nothing away, but her attention didn't waver. The old me might have stumbled in that moment, caught off guard by her presence. But I didn't. I kept speaking because this wasn't about her anymore. It was about me, and the life I had built without her approval. After the event, people gathered to talk, handing me business cards, asking questions, sharing their own dreams. Rachel waited until the crowd thinned, then walked toward me. She didn't offer a long speech or an apology, just a few quiet words. She was proud of me. I didn't dissect it or hold it up to the light, searching for flaws. I simply let it be what it was. Maybe it was pride, maybe respect, maybe something else entirely. It no longer mattered. My worth didn't hinge on her voice anymore. That evening, back in my studio, the setting sun stretched golden ribbons of light across the floor. I sat by the window with a cup of tea, listening to the hum of the city outside. My phone buzzed with messages from attendees, but I didn't rush to answer. I just let the quiet surround me. It struck me then. The real victory wasn't beating Rachel or proving her wrong. It was reaching the point where her opinion didn't decide who I was. I could accept her words without needing them. I could stand in my life, in my success, without comparison. In the months that followed, our paths would cross from time to time. The air between us had changed, not exactly warm, but no longer sharp. We spoke like two people who understood each other better than before, even if they would never say it aloud. The peace I felt wasn't loud or dramatic. It was quiet, steady, and deeply mine. The kind of peace that tells you you've made it home to yourself. If this journey touched you, let me know in the comments where you're watching from, and don't forget to like and subscribe for more emotional family stories. Your support means the world.